Our next speaker is a techie turned horticulturalist. Please welcome David Hernandez.
Hey guys, how's everyone tonight? Just so you understand the context of the night that I'm coming into, this would actually be everybody else's nightmare. Not only am I talking in front of a bunch of strangers, I have my mother, my coworkers, my friends, and everyone else I've ever known. All in the front row. But that's because this is just how important this is to me, and they know this, and that's why they're here tonight. And I'm sharing this with you guys. So tonight, I'm teaching you about Amorphophallus. This is going to be an introduction to exotic plants in general. While I do focus on this species, you're going to end up seeing connections to other plants, and I hope that by the end of this, you're going to actually realize that plants are really freaking cool. So let's jump into it right now, which is a phallus in your face. So in general speaking, what you're seeing now is about a group of about 30 species. And I want to highlight just for this, because for context this is really important. What you're seeing here is the flower on the left, and on the right is a leaf. Now those are the only two parts of a plant, of this particular plant, that are above ground. Everything else, the roots, the stems, everything that you would consider part of a plant would actually be under the dirt. So again, the only two parts are a leaf, like a tree, and the flower. This is important. So what is an Amorphophallus? So they belong to the group known as the Raceae family, which are commonly known as aroids, which are used to them as anthuriums, philodendrons, and calla lilies. If you haven't already noticed, but those who speak Latin are probably I've already understood that Amorphophallus, of course, stands for misshapen penis, and in this case of Amorphophallus titanum, that actually translates to giant misshapen penis, which is not a medical condition you want to have. And of course they are tropical to subtropical. You'll find them in Borneo, Sumatra, and those mostly equator countries, though there are none in the Americas. We do have a different species that is there, but the Dracontium. They are home to one of the largest flowers in the world, but as guys know, it depends on how you measure it, because there are different categories depending on which context it is. And this is the duckweed family, actually. This is the smallest flowers in the world. Each of these little things right here, just for comparison, each of these little tiny dots are actually an entire plant, and that plant will actually bloom. And right here you have, and some of them, such as the konjac and the Amorphophallus, the konjac is actually used in lipozine, for example, which is a common dietary supplement. And Amorphophallus you'll actually find in like noodles and stuff like that in Korea. It's usually called elephant foot yam, found in Asian markets, and you can actually get them pretty cheap if you know where to look. And so jumping into the life cycle, now I want you to, on the left over here, you'll see these are seeds from an unidentified species, and on the right you'll see that once they actually grow out, you'll actually see the leaves. Now I want you to pay close attention to what these seeds are doing. If you've ever grown lima beans, you know that the roots kind of one little tendril and it kind of goes straight down before it branches out. In this instance, you'll see the roots, you got several roots kind of shooting in all different directions. This is very important towards the future of what the plant does. So as you can see, as the leaf develops, you'll see all sorts of roots kind of shoot up in directions. Those long tendrils are actually anchor roots. They shoot out in all directions, they kind of go down, and then they kind of grow little smaller roots they grab onto and pull the plant to keep it stable. The reason being is because if you look right towards the bottom right here, there's something that looks kind of like a potato looking thing. That is actually the plant itself. Remember how I said the only parts above ground are the leaf and the flower? Again, that is actually the actual plant. So what's actually growing when the plant is developing is this part. So you can see these are actually, I will say tubers, but technically the actual correct term is corm, but again, tubers and corms tend to be interchangeable between the two. And you'll see as they'll grow, they'll shoot outwards and dig into that soil. Now the reason being is that between these two, sorry, actually auto-playing by accident, I don't even know why. How do I set this back over, sorry? So the reason being is that imagine if you were building a 5-story building and you decided to remove the first floor but you wanted to keep the other stories exactly where they were, that's exactly what those roots do. So you'll see the plant gets bigger as time goes on, and of course you'll end up seeing they get quite large. Again, remember, that is a leaf that can get up to 15 feet tall, and the circumference is just as wide towards the top, and he is actually 6'1", to give you context of just how big that gets. And this tuber is actually about definitely over 100 pounds, but some specimens have gone up to like 200 pounds, and it usually takes a group of people or a small crane in order to actually pot them up. And yes, you do have to think ahead because they do get top heavy, because that entire corm gets absorbed into the leaf. So there is actually a gap within the soil. So that's what those roots come in. They hold that leaf in place because otherwise it gets too top heavy until a new tuber forms underneath. So this cycle actually continues in perpetually, and it wasn't until a Japanese company by the name of Nintendo discovered that using a leaf stone, you can finally get them to bloom. Kidding, of course, although for your Pokemon fact of the day, the Rafflesia was actually the inspiration for Vileplume. But in actuality, the length of time between leaf and flower, because it usually depends on the smaller species, they will actually do both. But sometimes it's usually flower first and then leaf, especially for when you get to the larger ones, it's usually one or the other, not both. So in this instance, on a smaller scale, you probably can have them go blooming size anywhere within a year, but the extreme side of the scale would be about 10 years before it would bloom. And it would bloom the first time, and then after that it would bloom every 2 to 3 years after that. But that's in the instance of like the Titanum, or one of the giant species. And speaking of which, when phalluses are complete, they do fall over and shrink, and it's not very graceful. Now, on this instance, this is actually brought to me by a man named Matt Coulter. He's actually in South Australia. He's actually one of the horticulturists over there. And I have actually brought this story. This happened as most recent. So I want to point out a couple of things to you. So on the left over here, you see how it's quite actually I guess aerodynamic. I guess you would say it's quite pointy. When it comes to dormancy periods, you'll notice the date. This was February 9th, 2016, and it didn't wake up until December 5th, 2016. Dormancy periods for these kinds of plants usually range between, for the more tropical species, anywhere from a couple of weeks to about a month or so. But for the regular species, you'll probably see about 3 months difference. So this thing almost waited an entire year before it woke up, and we are expecting a leaf, because usually once they get to blooming size, it's leaf, flower, that's usually the pattern, or leaf, depending on how much time has passed. And the difference between a leaf and a flower, of course, is between the leaf itself has a more cylindrical shape, while the flower itself tends to be more stocky in shape. Unfortunately, in this instance, we noticed that there was a leaf and flower, which is not unheard of with 2 flowers in a row. It's rare, but as far as we can know, this is the first instance where we see a flower follow a flower and a leaf between the two. And it's kind of like a botanical version of a xenomorph, in which case this would be your face hugger. And you can see the flower itself has completed, and you can see exactly that little gap between the two. If you have like a mechanical, think of these things growing like a mechanical pencil. So what happens is, like, when you have the leaf growing and the tuber's growing, it's also preparing its next growth, which might be a leaf or flower, and that depends on the weight. By minimum, on this particular species, the minimum average weight is about 35 pounds before you can consider it a possibility for flowering, and some of that ranges a bit. But that's about the minimum before you can say, okay, this has a chance to flower at some point. And the flower cycle did complete. You can see the leaf and the flower. You can see on the bottom over here, you can see how the petiole, which is the actual, what you would consider the stem, is actually the petiole. The stem itself is actually underground. But you can see the petiole on the bottom was actually pushed out because of the swelling of the flower. And it is normal to have that little bit of space, but it's just dramatic with how large this flower had ended up going. And with a little bit of petiole rejuvenation, things get, nice and good. And of course, I sort of spoiled it, but this talk wouldn't be fun without the money shot. So remember when I said, considering how size is how you measure it with these things? In this category, technically the Amorphophallus titanum is referred to as the largest unbranched inflorescence, which terms to this. So when we're actually talking about the flower, the giant structure is not the flower. The red part that you see is actually a modified leaf. These are the actual flowers of the plant, and there are up to over 500 of them. So what on top, and they're divided in two halves. So the top half you see are the males and the bottoms are the females. This cycle only lasts 2 days, by the way. So after all that effort, this flower will only last 2 days. And the first day the female flowers are active, and the second day the male flowers are active. So there is no self-pollination. So it really relies on another plant being also available at the same time on a different day in order to actually get pollinated. And I see some of you turning your heads like, what? Yeah. So if it was pollinated, this is what you could actually see. This is called the infructescence, and you're probably most familiar with them in the form of a pineapple. It's actually the same kind of growth point with a bunch of flowers. The fruits grow, they merge into one organ-looking thing, but they're actually made up of a ton of little flowers. And of course, I did talk about the smell, as these flies do contest. You can see here, these flies have actually laid maggots, and those maggots did actually hatch. So when I came out, they were crawling all over it. And yes, they do smell bad, and depending on the species, they either smell like rotten egg, to rotten meat, to some that I can't identify, but I also don't mind. But that's just me. And of course, bad smells aren't unique, as you can see for the, I can't pronounce that one, my Latin is off, I'm sorry, but the Stapelia and the Synandrospadex rheumotoxicus, these are not aroids, or actually some of them are aroids, but they all are examples of plants that actually use smells that we wouldn't consider natural, or at least we're used to attract different kinds of pollinators. And of course, in the case of the eastern skunk cabbage, which merges two cross points, and the reason why I bring this up is not only does it smell bad, considering its name, skunk cabbage, but if you pay attention very closely, yes, that is in fact a plant that is melting snow. This plant, when it grows in the spring, actually produces enough heat to melt the snow around it so that we can actually bloom. And of course, when it crosses, and this particular plant is part of a group of plants known as thermogenic plants, which, as you can see here, the Titanum is actually the king of that as well. And in the natural areas of Sumatra, they actually do get as hot as our body heat. They do hit over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And they do produce heat in order to get past the cool tropical air. It's pretty much like a chimney. The cool tropical air kind of flows in by design with the going over the spathe, and then with that spadix being nice and warm, it kind of acts like a chimney. So then it produces that stench. It pushes it up, out over the tropical, over the rainforest trees, and hopefully, and it can go up to like a couple of miles out, and hopefully there's another flower blooming at some point that the pollinators will then smell and come to it at the same time. And as you can see here, they actually do produce, if it's humid and the temperatures are cool, and the outside temperatures are cool, you can actually see steam coming off of the spadix. But it does produce like a bit of a smelly sweat. So there are actually pores along the spadix, which again is that tip over there that's lighting up. And that stuff is actually like oozing the juices of like what it would smell like. And of course, this is going way too fast. I don't know why. I'm not even pushing buttons, but it's cool. But I did want to say at least, like, while I've been highlighting just the Titanum, because that is usually the corpse flower and Titan arum and snake voodoo lily, those are the common names I describe them, but they don't actually fit this particular group of plants. It actually can be considered several plants. But normally when you look up Amorphophallus, the Titanum is actually the one that's used as an example. But what I really brought today was because to show you the highlight of the differences. Not only do they look different, they are different, they smell different, and they grow differently. And I just wanted to show the variety of different blooms that you'll see between the conjac, the impressus, the eccentricus, the reflexus. Sorry, this thing's going faster than I am. To see also the Mulleriae and to the Coratenses. Like, there are so many species here. There are over 200 that are currently being cataloged, and there's still at least another 100 more that are currently being described. And of course, not just the flowers are unique. The petioles, which we consider the stems of the leaf, come in a variety of colors and textures. I don't have any ones that are actually rough, but you can see here between all of the different species, they all have different colors and textures. The last two over here are actually hybrids, and some of them are just flat out stunning. In fact, this one, you can't get it by photos, but if you were to look at it in person, for some reason, it will actually sparkle when it hits the sun. Like, it has a little bit of glitter. And people, different growers grow these. Some grow them for the flowers, a lot of them grow them for the vegetation, just because when you look at it, it's just gorgeous. And that's just the stems, or the petioles again. But the tops of the leaves as well also have all sorts of colors, shapes, patterns. And honestly, this isn't even the best things that I have. These are actually pictures that I took most recently, but I've seen things that are just stunning. But as much as I wanted to bring those today, a lot of what I brought was things that I've taken. Just to show, I like to use practical examples, and you can look online and find all other sorts of pictures, but these are actually from my collection. Now, how did it actually get here is actually an interesting question. So, when I came over here, I brought these were about 30 plants, which is what I mentioned about the beginning, and this was in about 2013. Back about around this time, I didn't really have these as a focus. These were just a casual hobby that I just grew whenever and just however. But it wasn't until meeting this guy. This is the Amorphophallus titanum, which is the king, but this is known as Mr. Stinky. This was that bloomed at Fairchild Tropical Garden back in 2003. This was probably about 6 to 7 feet tall, and I believe the cops were called by the neighbors because when it bloomed, the neighbors thought a body had become undug, and there were vultures. There were vultures circling over the botanical garden and stuff, and yeah, it was a whole spectacle. I'm not kidding when you tell you that this thing reeks, but I like it. But seeing this when I was a kid left such an impression on me, but I didn't even realize it because at that time I had left caring about plants so much at a certain point, so it really just kind of left on the back burner. And that just sat for years up until 2016 when I had met the caretaker of the Mr. Stinky by the name of Craig Allen. He was a conservatory manager at Fairchild during the time, and he had introduced me to Mr. Stinky at the time. And over a decade later, I actually reconnected with him at a different point in my life, and he ended up having yet again another titanum blooming, and this would be my second one by the same person. And when I saw this, something changed in me, and I guess I just remembered everything. And so I went from having maybe about 100 plants or so to deciding that, you know what, nature is what I want to protect. This is like just trying to find out what I wanted to do with my life and where I was going, and I had a bunch of plants sitting there. And so what ended up happening is not only did I end up discovering that there were places in Florida that looked like this, I ended up changing my entire life to the point where not only did I end up seeing some gorgeous things, I end up, I don't know why it's playing automatically, I'm sorry guys. But I ended up having a great collection of plants, to teaching children, to seeing other stuff, to having my first plant show. There you go! Spoilers, okay, so, fast forward, apparently, is what I ended up with is from about the end of 2015, I hadn't really considered this as a life, as something that I wanted to pursue, and that was the end of 2015. So after I had seen the titanum again, within about a year I went from about 120 plants to well over 800 by the end of last year, and that was about a year period, and I've seen so many things. I took a master gardener course. I ended up changing everything around, not only to protect these plants, but also so much more, and that's why I brought them today, and to show you that I wanted to show them all that they are just amazing, busy things, but because they live on a different time scale than us, we just don't pay attention to them. And unfortunately, there's deforestation and climate change, and honestly, one of my goals in my life is actually to see a titanum in Sumatra, and I may not get that chance. Because last year, I couldn't fit it into this presentation because I thought it was way too dark, but I'll mention it just offhandedly. There were huge fires in Indonesia region last year, and over 100,000 people have died, and tons of land has been burned, and that is where a number of these species actually come from. Those are the only places they call home. And we're reaching the point now between life and plant, you know, it's all going downhill. And it hurts to even think that I won't be able to get to see that thing in nature, honestly. And but yeah, so I've taken control of it myself, and this is my life. And yeah, so I started a company on top of all this. And So if you're interested in any of this, you can follow Leaf Gardens on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you go to leafgardens.com in about 1 minute, there will also be a ton of it, because I haven't posted it, but give me 1 minute. But there will be a ton of resources available for all of you here in Miami. There, I will link you to Master Gardener programs. I will link you to local parks, things I've been involved in for the past year. There have been so many things that I just want to put out there. And we really need people who really just want to make a difference. It's fine that you want to protect the environment, but you need to do something about it. And there's not enough of us is doing it right now. And sometimes people just don't know what to do. So if you go to leafgardens.com, and really in just about 5 minutes, less than that or so, there's going to be a ton of resources there to get you started. If you have any questions, just ask me, because honestly, there's people like me who have tons of answers for you, but you just have to ask. And if for some reason you find me interesting, of course, I started my own personal Twitter and Instagram profile called Vocal Gecko. It's brand new, so it's not much there, but thank you guys so much. It's been a pleasure.